Flying Saucers by C.J. Young, Chapter 2, Ufos and Dreams. Not only are UFOs seen, they are of course also dreamt about. This is particularly interesting to the psychologist because the dreams tell us in what sense they are understood by the unconscious. In order to form anything like a complete picture of an object reflected in the psyche, far more than an exclusively intellectual operation is required. In addition to the three other functions of feeling, valuation, sensation, reality, sense, and intuition, perception of possibilities, we need the reaction of the unconscious, i.e. the picture of the unconscious associative context. It is this total view that alone makes possible a whole judgment on the psychic situation constellated by the object. An exclusively intellectual approach is bound to be from 50 to 75% unsatisfactory. By way of illustration, I shall cite two dreams dreamt by an educated lady. She had never seen a UFO, but was interested in the phenomenon without being able to form a definite picture of it. She did not know the UFO literature, nor was she acquainted with my ideas on the subject. Dream 1. I was going down the Champs-Élysées in a bus with many other people. Suddenly the air raid warning sounded. The bus stopped and all the passengers jumped out, and the next moment they had disappeared into the nearest houses, banging the doors behind them. I was the last to leave the bus. I tried to get into a house, but all the door with their polished brass knobs were tightly shut, and the whole Champs-Élysées was empty. I pressed against the wall of a house and looked up at the sky. Instead of the expected bombers, I saw a sort of flying saucer, a metallic sphere shaped like a drop. It was flying along quite slowly from north to east, and I had the impression that I was being observed. In the silence, I heard the high heels of a woman who was walking alone on the empty sidewalk down the Champs-Élysées. The atmosphere was most uncanny. Dream 2, about a month later. I was walking at night in the streets of a city. Interplanetary machines appeared in the sky, and everyone fled. The machines looked like large steel cigars. I did not flee. One of the machines spotted me and came straight towards me at an oblique angle. I think Professor Young says that one should not run away, so I stand still and look at the machine. From the front, seen close to it, it looked like a circular eye, half blue, half white. A room in a hospital. My two chiefs come in, very worried, and ask my sister how it is going. My sister replied that the mere sight of the machine had burnt my whole face. Only then did I realize they were talking about me, and that my whole head was bandaged, even though I could not see it. Commentary to Dream 1. The dream describes as the exposition of the initial situation a mass panic as an air raid warning. A UFO appears having the form of a drop. A fluid body assumes the form of a drop when it is about to fall, from which it is clear that the UFO is conceived as a liquid falling from the sky like rain. This surprising drop form of the UFO and the analogy to a fluid occur in the literature. Footnote. A report on the case of Captain Mantell now becomes a classic, speaks of the UFO's resemblance to a teardrop and says it behaved like a fluid. From Harold T. or Captain or CF Harold T. Wilkins, Flying Saucers on the Attack, New York Citadel, 1954, page 90. Anyway, presumably it is meant to express the commonly reported changeability of the UFO's shape. This heavenly fluid must be of mysterious nature, and is probably a conception similar to that of the alchemical aqua permanens, or permanent water, which was also called heaven in the 16th century alchemy and stood for quinta essentia. This water is the deus ex machina, or deus ex machina, of alchemy, the wonderful solvent, the word solutio being used equally for a chemical solution and for the solution of a problem. Indeed, it is the great magician Mercurius himself, the dissolver and binder, solve et coagula, the physical and spiritual panacea, which at the same time can be something threatening and dangerous and falls in the aqua coalescentis from heaven. Just as the alchemists speak of their stone, which is no stone, and of their philosophical water, which is no water but quicksilver, and no ordinary Hg at that, but a spirit, pneuma. It represents the arcane substance, which during the alchemical operation changes from a base metal to a spiritual form, often personified as Phileas Hermaphroditus, Phileas Macrocosmi, etc. The water of the philosophers is a classic substance that transmutes the chemical elements, and during their transformation is itself transformed. It is also the redeeming spirit. These ideas began far back in the literature of antiquity, underwent further development during the Middle Ages, and even penetrated into folklore and fairy tale. The very ancient text, possibly 1st century AD, says that in the stone, that it is found in the Nile there is a spirit. Reach into thy hand and draw forth spirit. That is the ex hydra gerosis, the expulsion of the quicksilver. For a period of nearly 1,700 years, we have ample testimonies to the effectiveness of this animistic archetype. Mercurius is on the one hand a metal, on the other a fluid that can easily be volatilized, i.e. changed into vapor or spirit. This is known as Spiritus Mercurii and was regarded as a kind of Panacea savior or Servator Mundi, preserver of the world. Mercurius is a bringer of healing, who makes peace between enemies as the food of immortality. He saves creation from sickness and corruption, just as Christ saved mankind. In the language of the Church Fathers, Christ is the springing fountain, and in the same way the alchemist called Mercurius aqua permanens, ros Gideonus, Gideon's dew, vinen ardens, fiery wine, mare nostrum, our sea, sanguis, blood, etc. From many of the reports, particularly the early ones, it is evident that the UFOs can appear suddenly and vanish equally suddenly. They can be tracked by radar but remain invisible to the eye, and conversely can be seen by the eye but not detected by radar. UFOs can make themselves invisible at will, it is said, and must obviously consist of a substance that is visible at one moment and invisible in the next. The nearest analogy to this is a volatile liquid which condenses out of an invisible state into the form of drops. In reading the old text, one can still feel the miracle of disappearance and reappearance which the alchemist beheld in the vaporization of water or quicksilver. For them it was the transformation of the souls that had become water, Heraclitus, into the invisible pneuma at the touch of Hermes' wand, and their descent out of the empyrean into the visible form again. Zosimos of Panopolis, 3rd century AD, has left us with a valuable document describing the transformation, which takes place in a cooking vessel. The fantasies born of musing over the steaming cooking pot, one of the most ancient experiences of mankind, may also be responsible for the sudden disappearance and reappearance of the UFO. The unexpected drop form in a dream has prompted a comparison with the central conception of alchemy known to us not only from Europe but also from India and 2nd century China. The extraordinariness of the UFOs is paralleled by the extraordinariness of the psychological context, which has to be adduced if we are to risk any interpretation at all. Considering the essential weirdness of the UFO phenomenon, we cannot expect the familiar rationalistic principle of explanation to be in any way adequate. A psychoanalytic approach to the problem could do nothing more than turn the whole idea of UFOs into a sexual fantasy, at most arriving at the conclusion that a repressed uterus was coming down from the sky. This would not fit too badly with the old medical view of hysteria, in Greek hysteros equals womb, as a wandering of the uterus, especially in the case of a woman who had an anxiety dream. But then, what about the masculine pilots, who are the chief authors of the rumor? The language of sex is hardly more significant than any other symbolic means of expression. This type of explanation is, at the bottom, just as mythological and rationalistic as the technological fables about the nature and purpose of UFOs. The dreamer knew enough about psychology to realize in her second dream the necessity of not giving in to her fear and running away, as she would dearly have liked to do. But the unconscious created a situation in which this way out was barred. Consequently, she had an opportunity to observe the phenomena at close quarters. It proved to be harmless. Indeed, the untroubled footsteps of a woman point to someone who either is not aware of it at all, or is free from fear. Commentary to Dream 2. The exposition begins with the statement that it is night and dark, a time when normally everyone is asleep and dreaming. As in the previous dream, panic breaks out. A number of UFOs appear. Recalling the first commentary, we would say that the unity of a self is a supraordinate, semi-divine figure, has broken up into a plurality. On a mythological level, this would correspond to the plurality of gods, god-men, demons, or souls. In Hermic philosophy, the arcane substance has 1,000 names, but essentially it consists of one and only one, i.e. God, and this principle only becomes pluralized through being split up, multiplicatio. The alchemists were consciously performing an opus divinum in that they sought to free the soul in chains, i.e. to release the demiurge distributed and imprisoned in his own creation and restore him to his original condition of unity. Looked at psychologically, the plurality of the symbol of unity signifies a splitting into many independent units, into a number of selves. The one metaphysical principle representing the idea of monotheism is dissolved into a plurality of subordinate deities. From the standpoint of Christian dogma, such an operation could easily be construed as arch-heresy, were it not that this view is contradicted by the unequivocal saying of Christ, "Ye are gods," and by the equally emphatic idea that we are all God's children, both of which presuppose men at least potential kinship with God. From the psychological point of view, however, the plurality of UFOs would correspond to the projection of a plurality of human individuals, the choice of symbol, spherical object, indicating the content of the projection, is not the actual people themselves, but rather their ideal psychic totality, not the empirical man as he knows himself to be from experience, but his whole psyche, the conscious contents of which have still to be supplemented by the contents of the unconscious. Although we know from our investigations a number of things about the unconscious which give us some clue as to its nature, we are still very far from being able to sketch out even a hypothetical picture that is in any way adequate. To mention only one of the great difficulties, there are parapsychological experiences which can no longer be denied and have to be taken into account in evaluating the psychic processes. The unconscious can no longer be treated as if it were causally dependent on consciousness, since it possesses qualities which are not under conscious control. It should rather be understood as an autonomous entity acting reciprocally with consciousness. The plurality of UFOs, then, is a projection of a number of psychic images of wholeness which appear in the sky, because on the one hand they represent archetypes charged with energy, and on the other hand are not recognized as psychic factors. The reason for this is that our present-day consciousness possesses no conceptual categories by means of which it could apprehend the nature of psychic totality. It is still in an archaic state, so to speak, in which apparitions of this kind cannot be recognized as psychic factors. Moreover, it is so trained that it must think of such images not as forms inherent in the psyche, but as existing somewhere in extra-psychic, metaphysical space, or else as historical facts. When, therefore, the archetype retrieves from the condition of the time and from the general psychic situation as additional charge of energy, it cannot, for the reasons I have described, be integrated directly into consciousness, but is forced to manifest itself indirectly in the form of spontaneous projections. The projected image then appears as an ostensibly physical fact independent of the individual psyche and its nature. In other words, the rounded wholeness of the mandala becomes a spaceship controlled by intelligent beings. The usually lens-shaped form of the UFOs may be helped with the fact that psychic wholeness, as the historical testimonies show, has always been characterized by certain cosmic affinities. The individual soul was thought to be of heavenly origin, a particle of the world soul, and hence a microcosm, a reflection of the macrocosm. Leibniz's monadology is an eloquent example of this. The microcosm is the starry world around us, which, appearing in the naive mind as spherical, gives the soul its traditional spherical form. Additionally, the astronomical heavens are filled with mainly lens-shaped agglomerations of stars, the galaxies, similar in form to that of UFOs. This form may possibly be a concession to the recent astronomical findings, for to my knowledge there are no older traditions that speak of the soul having the form of a lens. Here we may have an instance of an older tradition being modified by recent additions to knowledge and influencing of primordial ideas by the latest acquisitions of consciousness, like the frequent substitution of automobiles and airplanes for animals and monsters in modern dreams. It must be emphasized, however, that there is also the possibility of natural or absolute knowledge, where the unconscious psyche coincides with objective facts. This is a problem that has been raised by the discoveries of parapsychology. Absolute knowledge occurs not only in telepathy and precognition, but also in biology, for instance, in the attunement of the virus of hydrophobia to the anatomy of dog and man as described by Portman. Footnote. Portman, Significance of Images in the Living Transformation of Energy, 1952. End footnote. The wasp's apparent knowledge of where the motor ganglia was located in the caterpillar, that is to nourish the wasp's prodigy, the emission of light by certain fishes and insects were almost 100% efficiency, the directional sense of carrier pigeons, the warning of earthquakes given by chickens and cats, and the amazing cooperation found in symbiotic relationships. We know, too, that life's processes cannot be explained only by causality, but require intelligent choices. The shape of the UFOs in this sense is analogous to that of the elements composing the structure of space, the galaxies, no matter how ridiculous this seems to human reason. In our dream, the usual lens-shaped form is replaced by a rare cigar form, derived apparently from the old dirigible airships. As in Dream 1, a psychoanalytic approach could be reported to the female symbol, the uterus, to explain the drop, so here the sexual analogy of the phallic form leaps to the eye. The archaic background of the psyche has this much in common with primitive language, that they both translate unknown or incompletely understood things into instinctive and habitual forms of thought, so that Freud could, with some justification, establish that all round or hollow forms have feminine and all oblong ones a masculine meaning, as for instance nuts and bolts, female and male pipe joints, etc. In these cases, the interest that naturally attaches to sex stimulates the making of such analogies, not to speak of the amusing illustrations they provide. Still, sex is not the sole instigator of these metaphors. There is also hunger, the urge to eat and drink. In the history of religion, there are not only sexual unions with the gods, but also eaten and drunk. Even sexual attraction has become the object of these metaphors. We like a girl so much we would eat her. Language is full of metaphors which express one instinct in terms of another. But we need not conclude that the real and essential thing is always love, or hunger, or the urge to power, etc. The main point is that every situation activates the relevant instinct, which then dominates as a vital need and decides the choice of symbol as well as its interpretation. Footnote. The phallus is not a sign that indicates a penis. This is a symbol because it has so many other meanings. End of footnote. Very probably there is a phallic analogy in the dream, which, in accordance with the meaning of this exceedingly archaic symbol, gives the UFO the characteristic of something procreative, fructifying, and in the broadest sense, penetrating. Footnotes. Dionysus, for instance, was invoked as Eclopius, he in the lap. End of footnote. In ancient times, the feeling of being penetrated by or of receiving the god was allegorized by the sexual act, but it would be a gross misunderstanding to interpret a genuine religious experience as repressed sexual fantasy on account of mere metaphor. The penetration can also be expressed by a sword, a spear, or an arrow. The dreamer does not flee from the menacing aspect of the UFO, even when she sees it coming straight at her. During this confrontation, the original sphere or lens-shaped aspect reappears in the form of a circular eye. This image corresponds to the traditional eye of God, which, all-seeing, searches the hearts of people, laying bare the truth and pitilessly exposing every cranny of the soul. It is a reflection of one's insight into the total reality of one's own being. The eye is half blue, half white. This corresponds to the colors of the sky, its pure blue and whiteness of the clouds that obscure its transparency. The psychic totality, the self, is a combination of opposites. Without a shadow, even the self is not real. It always has two aspects, a bright and a dark, like the pre-Christian idea of the God in the Old Testament, which is so much better suited to the facts of religious experience, Revelations 14:7, than the summum bonum, based as this is on the precarious foundation of mere syllogism, the privatio boni. Even the highly Christian Jacob Boehm could not escape this insight and gave eloquent expression to it in his 40 Questions Concerning the Soul. The drop-shaped UFO, suggesting a fluid substance, a sort of water, makes way for a circular structure which not only sees, i.e. emits light, according to the old view, light is equivalent to seeing, but also sends out a scorching heat. One immediately thinks of the intolerable radiance that shone from the face of Moses after he had seen God, of who amongst us shall dwell with everlasting burnings, Isaiah 33:14, and of the saying of Jesus, he who is near unto me is near unto fire. Nowadays, people who have an experience of this kind are more likely to go running to the doctor or psychiatrist than to a theologian. I have more than once been consulted by people who were terrified by their dreams and visions. They took them for symbols of mental illness, possibly heralding insanity, whereas in reality they were dreams sent by God, real and genuine religious experiences that collided with a mind unprepared, ignorant, or profoundly prejudiced. In this matter, there is little choice today. Anything out of the ordinary can only be pathological. For that abstraction, the statistical average counts as the ultimate truth, and not reality. All feeling for value is repressed in the interest of a narrow intellect and biased reason. So, it is no wonder that after her UFO experience, our patient woke up in a hospital with a burned face. This is only to be expected today. The second dream differs from the first in that it brings out the dreamer's inner relationship to the UFO. The UFO has marked her out, the UFO has marked her out, and not only turns a searching eye onto her, but irradiates her with magical heat, a synonym for her very own inner affectivity. Fire is the symbolical equivalent of a very strong emotion or affect, which in this case comes upon her quite unexpectedly. In spite of her justifiable fear of the UFO, she held her ground, as though it were intrinsically harmless, but is now made to realize that it is capable of sending out a deadly heat, a statement we often meet with in the UFO literature. So, keyhole, the flying saucer conspiracy. That's a footnote. Anyway, this heat is a projection of her own unrealized emotion, that is, of a feeling that has intensified into an effect but remains unrecognized. Even her facial expression was altered, burnt by it. This recalls not only the changed face of Moses, but also that of Brother Klaus, after his terrifying vision of God. Cf. Brother Klaus, Psychology and Religion, Collected Works, Volume 11, New York, Pantheon, 1958. End of footnote. It points to an indelible experience whose traces remain visible to others because it has brought about a demonstrable change in the entire personality. Psychologically, of course, such an event bestokes only a potential change. It has first to be integrated into consciousness. This is why Brother Klaus felt it necessary to spend long years in wearisome study and meditation until he succeeded in recognizing his terrifying vision as a vision of the Holy Trinity, in accordance with the spirit of the age, thus transforming the experience into an integrated conscious content that was intellectually and morally binding for him. This work has still to be done by the dreamer, and perhaps by all who see UFOs, dream of them, or spread rumors about them. The symbols of the divinity coincide with that of the self. What, on the one hand, appears as a psychological experience signifying psychic wholeness, expresses on the other side the idea of God. This is not to assert a metaphysical identity of the two, but merely the empirical identity of the images representing them, which all originate in the human psyche, as our dream shows. What the metaphysical conditions are for the similarity of the images is, like everything, transcendental, beyond human knowledge. The motif of the isolated God's eye, which the unconscious proffers as an interpretation of the UFO, can be found in ancient Egyptian mythology as the eye of Horus, who, with its help, healed the partial blinding of his father Osiris, caused by Set. The isolated God's eye also appears in Christian iconography. In dealing with the products of the collective unconscious, all images that show an unmistakably mythological character have to be examined in their symbological context. They are the inborn language of the psyche and its structure, and, as regards their basic forms, are in no sense individual acquisitions. Despite its capacity for learning and for consciousness, the human psyche is a natural phenomenon like the psyche of animals and is based on inborn instincts which bring their own specific forms with them, and in this way constitute the heredity of the species. Volition, intention, and all the personal differentiations are acquired late and owe their existence to a consciousness that has emancipated itself from mere instinctivity. Wherever it is a question of archetypal formations, personalistic attempts at explanation lead us astray. The method of comparative symbology, on the other hand, not only proves fruitful on scientific grounds, but makes a deeper understanding possible in practice. The symbological or amplificatory approach produces a result that looks at first like a translation back into primitive language. And so it would be if understanding with the help of the unconscious were a purely intellectual affair and not one that brought our total capacity to play. In other words, besides its formal mode of manifestation, the archetype also possesses a numinous quality, a feeling value that is highly effective in practice. One can be unconscious of its value, since it can be repressed artificially, but a repression has neurotic consequences, because the repressed affect still exists and simply makes an outlet for itself elsewhere, in some unsuitable place. As our dream shows very clearly, the UFO comes from the unconscious background, which has always been expressed in numinous ideas and images. It is these that give us the strange phenomenon. It is these that give the strange phenomenon an interpretation that makes it appear in a significant light. Significant not merely because they arose dim in historical memories which link up with the findings of comparative psychology, but because actual affective processes are at work. Today, as never before, people pay extraordinary amount of attention to the skies for technological reasons. This is especially true of the air people, whose field of vision is occupied on the one hand by the complicated control apparatus before them, and on the other by the empty vastness of cosmic space. Their consciousness is concentrated one-sidedly on details requiring the most careful observation, while at their back, so to speak, their unconscious strives to fill the illimitable emptiness of space. Their training and their common sense both preclude them from observing all the things that might rise up from within and become visible in order to compensate the emptiness and solitude of flight high above the earth. Such a situation provides the ideal conditions for spontaneous psychological phenomena, and everyone knows who has lived sufficiently long in the solitude, silence, and emptiness of deserts, seas, mountains, or primeval forests. Rationalism and boredom are essentially products of the overindulged craving for stimulation so characteristic of urban populations. The city dweller seeks artificial sensations to escape their boredom. The hermit does not seek them, but is plagued by them against their will. We know from the life of ascetics, ascetics, of aesthetes, I don't know that word, and anchorites, that whether they would or no, and without any assistance from consciousness, spontaneous psychic phenomena rose up to compensate their biological needs, numinous fantasy images, visions, and hallucinations, which were evaluated either positively or negatively. Those positively evaluated derived from a sphere of the unconscious felt to be spiritual, the others obviously from the instinctual world, which they knew only too well, where loaded dishes and flagons and luscious meals stilled their hunger. Seductive and voluptuous beings yielded themselves to their pent-up sexual desire. Riches and worldly power took the place of poverty and lack of influence, and bustling crowds, noise, and music enlivened the intolerable silence and loneliness. Although it is easy to speak here of images caused by repressed wishes and explain the projection of fantasy that way, it does not explain the visions that were evaluated positively, because these do not correspond to a repressed wish, but to one that is fully conscious and therefore cannot produce a projection. A psychic content can only appear as a projection when its connection with the ego personality is not recognized. For this reason, the wish hypothesis must be discarded. The hermits sought to attain a spiritual experience, and for this purpose they mortified the earthly person. Naturally enough, the affronted world of instinct reacted with unseemly projections, but the spiritual sphere, too, responded with projections of a positive nature, most unexpectedly to our scientific way of thinking. For the spiritual sphere had not been neglected in any way. On the contrary, it was nurtured with the greatest possible devotion through prayer, meditation, and other spiritual exercises. So according to our hypothesis, it should have had no need of compensation. Its one-sidedness, which insisted on mortifying the body, was already compensated by the violent reaction on part of the instincts. Nevertheless, the spontaneous appearance of positive projections in the form of numinous images was experienced as grace and felt to be a divine revelation. Indeed, they are characterized as such by the content of the visions. Psychologically speaking, these visions behave in exactly the same way as visions produced by the neglected instincts, despite the undeniable fact that the saints did everything to foster their spirituality. They did not mortify the spiritual man, and therefore needed no compensation in this respect. If, in the face of this dilemma, we cling to the proven truth of the compensation theory, we are driven to the paradoxical conclusion that, despite appearances to the contrary, the spiritual situation of the hermit was one of deficiency after all, and that it needed an appropriate compensation, just as physical hunger is sated, at least metaphorically, by the sight of a marvelous meal, so the hunger of the soul is sated by the vision of a numinous image. But it is not so easy to see why the anchorite's soul should have suffered from hunger. She stakes her whole life on earning the panis supersubstantialis, the super-essential bread, which alone appeases her hunger, and besides that, she has the faith, doctrines, and means of grace of the Church at her disposal. Why, then, should she lack anything? All this she has, but the fact remains that she is not nourished by it, and her unappeasable desire remains unfulfilled. What obviously she still lacks is the actual and immediate experience of spiritual reality, however it may turn out. Whether it presents itself to her more or less concretely or symbolically makes little difference. In any case, she is not expecting the physical tangibility of any earthly thing, but rather the sublime intangibleness of a spiritual vision. This experience is, in itself, a compensation for the barrenness and emptiness of traditional forms, and accordingly she values it above all else, for in fact there appears before her, uncreated by herself, a numinous image which is just as real and actual, because it acts upon her, as the illusions spun by her neglected instincts. It is, however, as much desired by her on account of its reality and spontaneity as the illusions of her senses are undesired. So long as this numinous contents can avail themselves, in one way or another, of the traditional forms, there is no cause for disquiet. But when they betray their archaism by assuming unusual and obnoxious features, the matter becomes painfully dubious. The saint then begins to doubt whether they are any less illusory than the delusions of the senses. Indeed, it may even happen that a revelation originally regarded as divine is subsequently damned as a deception of the devil. The criterion of distinction is simply and solely traditional, not reality or unreality as in the case of real or illusory meal. The vision is a psychic phenomenon, just as are its numinous contents. Here, spirit answers spirit, whereas, in fact, the need for food is answered by a hallucination and not by a real meal. In the first case, the bill is paid in cash. In the second case, by an unbacked check. The one solution is satisfying, the other, obviously not. In both cases, the structure of the phenomenon is the same. Physical hunger needs a real meal, and spiritual hunger needs a numinous content. Such contents are by nature archetypal and have always expressed themselves in the form of natural revelations. For Christian symbolism, like all other religious ideas, is backed by archetypal models that go back into prehistory. The total character of these symbols includes every kind of human interest and instinct, thereby guaranteeing the numinosity of the archetype. This is why, in comparative religion, we so often find the religions and spiritual aspects associated with those of sexuality, hunger, aggression, power, etc. A particularly fruitful source of religious symbolism is the instinct to which most importance is attached in a given epoch of culture, or which is of most concern to the individual. There are communities in which hunger is more important than sex, and vice versa. Our civilization bothers us less with food taboos than with sexual restrictions. In modern society, these have come to play the role of an injured deity that is getting its own back in every sphere of human activity, including psychology, where it would reduce spirit to sexual repression. However, a partial interpretation of the symbolism in sexual terms should be taken seriously. If the striving for a spiritual goal is not a genuine instinct but merely a result of a particular social development, then an explanation according to sexual principles is the most appropriate and the most acceptable to reason. But even if we grant the striving for wholeness and unity the character of a genuine instinct, and base our explanation mainly on this principle, the fact still remains that there is a close association between sexual instinct and the striving for wholeness. With the exception of religious longings, nothing challenges modern people more consciously and personally than sex. One can also say in good faith that she is possessed even more by the power of instinct. This question will be decided according to temperament and one's own subjective basis. The only thing we cannot doubt is that the most important of the fundamental instincts, the religious instinct for wholeness, plays the least conspicuous part in contemporary consciousness because, as history shows, it can free itself only with great effort and with continual backslidings from contamination with the other two instincts. These can constantly appeal to common, everyday facts known to everyone, but the religious instinct requires for its evidence a more highly differentiated consciousness, thoughtfulness, reflection, responsibility, and sundry other virtues. Therefore, It does not commend itself to the relatively unconscious person driven by their natural impulses, because, imprisoned by their familiar world, they cling to the commonplace, the obvious, the probable, the collective valid, using for their motto, "Thinking is difficult, therefore let the herd pronounce judgment." It is an enormous relief to them when something that looks complicated, unusual, puzzling, and problematical can be reduced to something ordinary, banal, especially when the solution strikes them as surprisingly simple and somewhat droll. The most convenient explanations are invariably sex and the power instinct, and reduction to these two dominants gives rationalists and materialists an ill-concealed satisfaction. They have neatly disposed of an intellectually and morally uncomfortable difficulty, and on top of that, can enjoy the feeling of having accomplished a useful work of enlightenment, which will free the individual from unnecessary moral and social burdens. In this way, they can pose as benefactors of people. On closer inspection, however, things look very different. The exemption of the individual from a difficult and apparently insoluble task drives sexuality into even more pernicious repressions, where it is replaced by rationalism or by devastating cynicism, while the power instinct is driven towards some socialistic ideal that has already turned half the world into the state prison of communism. This is the exact opposite of what the striving for wholeness wants, namely to free the individual from the compulsion of the other two instincts. The task before them comes back with all its energies unused and reinforces to an almost pathological degree the very instincts that have always stood in the way of people's higher development. At all events, it has a neuroticizing effect characteristic of our time, and must bear most of the blame for the splitting of the individual and of the world in general. We just will not admit the shadow, and so the right hand does not know what the left is doing. Correctly appraising the situation, the Catholic Church, while counting sexual sins amongst the venal ones, therefore keeps a sharp eye upon sexuality as the chief enemy in practice and ferrets it out in all concerns. She thus creates an astute consciousness of sex, deleterious to weaker spirits, but of advantage in promoting reflection and broadening the consciousness of the stronger. The worldly pomps of the Catholic Church, for which she is reproached by the Protestants, have the obvious purpose of keeping the power of the spirit visibly before the natural power instinct. This is infinitely more effective than the best logical argument, which no one likes following. Only the tiniest fraction of the population will learn anything from reflection. Everything else consists of the suggestive power of example. After this digression, let us turn back to the problem of sexual interpretation. If we try to refine the psychological structure of the religious experience, which saves, heals, and makes whole, the simplest form, we can find would seem to be the following. In religious experience, people come face to face with a psychically overwhelming other. As to the existence of this power, we have only assertions, but no physical or logical proofs. It comes upon people in psychic guise. We cannot explain it as exclusively spiritual, for experience would immediately compel us to retract such a judgment, since the vision, according to the psychic disposition of the individual, often assumes the form of sexuality or of some other unspiritual impulse. Only something overwhelming, no matter what form of expression it uses, can challenge the whole person and force them to react as a whole. It cannot be proved that such things happen or that they must occur, nor is there any proof that they are anything more than psychic. Footnote. Neither is there any proof that they are only psychic. End of footnote. Since the evidence for them rests solely on personal statements and avowals. Thus, in view of the crass undervaluation of the psyche in our predominantly materialistic and statistical age, sounds like a condemnation of religious experience. Consequently, the average intelligence takes refuge either in unbelief or incredulity, for to it the psyche is no more than a miserable wisp of a vapor. Either there are hard and fast facts, or it is nothing but illusion begotten by repressed spirit sexuality, or an overcompensated inferiority complex. As against this, I have urged that the psyche be recognized as having its own peculiar reality. Despite the advances in organic chemistry, we are still very far from being able to explain consciousness as a biochemical process. On the contrary, we have to admit that chemical laws do not even explain the selective process of food assimilation, let alone the self-regulation and self-preservation of the organism. Whatever the reality of the psyche may be, it seems to coincide with the reality of life, at the same time to have a connection with the formal laws governing the inorganic world. For the psyche has yet another property, which most of us would rather not admit, namely the peculiar factor which relativizes space and time, and is now the object of intensive parapsychological research. Since the discovery of the empirical unconscious, the psyche and what goes on it have become a natural fact, and are no longer an arbitrary opinion, which they undoubtedly would be if they owed their existence to the caprices of a rootless consciousness. But consciousness, for all its kaleidoscopic morbidity, rests, as we know, on the comparatively static or at least highly constructive foundation of the instincts and their specific forms, the archetypes. This world in the background, footnote, here I must beg the reader to eschew the popular misconception that this background is metaphysical. This view is a piece of gross carelessness of which even professional people are guilty. It is far more a question of instincts, which influence not only our outward behavior, but also the psychic structure. The psyche is not an arbitrary fantasy. It is a biological fact, subject to the laws of life. All right, end of footnote. So, this world in the background, there was a footnote, proves to be the opponent of consciousness, which, because of its mobility, learning capacity, is often in danger of losing its roots. This is why, since the earliest times, people have felt compelled to perform rites for the purpose of securing the cooperation of the unconscious. It is a primitive world no one reckons without their host. They are constantly mindful of the gods, the spirits, of fate, and the magical qualities of time and place, rightly recognizing that people's solidarity will is only a fragment of a total situation. But people's solitary will is only a fragment of a total situation. Primitive people's actions have a total character, which civilized people would like to be rid of, as though it were an unnecessary burden. Things seem to go all right without it. The great advantage of this attitude lies in the development of a discernible consciousness, but it has the almost equally disadvantage of breaking down people's original wholeness into separate functions which conflict with one another. This loss has made itself increasingly felt in modern times. I need only remind you of Nietzsche's Dionysian experience of a breakthrough, and of that trend in German philosophy, which most obvious symptom in the book by Ludwig Krauss, The Spirit of the Adversary of the Soul. Through this fragmentation process, one or other of the functions of consciousness becomes highly differentiated and can then escape the control of the other functions to such an extent that it attains a kind of autonomy, constructing a world of its own into which these other functions are admitted only so far as they can be subjugated to the dominant function. In this way, consciousness loses its balance, and the intellect predominates. Then the value judgment of feelings are weakened, and vice versa. Again, if sensation is predominant, intuition is barred, this being the function that pays the least attention to tangible facts, and conversely, a man with an excess of intuition lives in a world of unprovable possibilities. The useful result of such developments is specialism, but that also promotes the disagreeable one-sidedness. It is just this capacity for one-sidedness which binds us which bids us observe things from one angle only, and if possible to reduce them to singular principle. In psychology, this attitude inevitably leads to explanations in terms of one particular bias. For instance, in a case of marked extroversion, the whole of the psyche is tracked back to environmental influences, while in introversion, it is tracked back to the hereditary psychological disposition and the intellectual and emotional factors that go with it. Both explanations tend to turn the psychic apparatus into a machine. Anyone who tries to be equally fair to both points of view is accused of obscurantism. Yet both of them should be applied, even if a series of paradoxical statements is the result. Hence, in order to avoid multiplying the principle of explanation, one of the easily recognizable basic instincts will be preferred at the expense of the other. Nietzsche bases everything on power, Freud on pleasure and its frustration. While in Nietzsche the unconscious can be felt as a factor of some importance, and in Freud become the sine qua non of his theory, though without ever sloughing off the character of being somewhat secondary and nothing but the result of repression. In Adler, the field of vision is narrowed down to a subjective prestige psychology, where the unconscious as a possibly decisive factor disappears from sight altogether. This fate has also overtaken Freud's psychoanalysis as practiced by the second generation. The significant beginnings he made towards a psychology of the unconscious stopped short at a single archetype, that of the Oedipus complex, and were not developed further by the more rigorous of his pupils. The evidence for the sexual instinct is, in the case of an incest complex, so patently obvious that a philosophically limited intelligence could be satisfied with that. The same is true of Adler's subjective will to power. Both views remain caught in an instinctual premise which leaves no room for the other, and so lands us in the specialist cul-de-sac of fragmentary explanation. Freud's pioneer work, on the other hand, gave access to the well-documented history of psychic phenomenology, and thus this allows us something like a symptomatic view of the psyche. The psyche does not express itself merely in the narrow subjective sphere of the individual personality, but, over and above that, in collective psychic phenomenon of whose existence Freud was aware, at least in principle, as his concept of the superego shows. For the time being, however, method and theory will remain in the hands of the psychiatrist, who of necessity is concerned only with individuals and their urgent personal problems. An investigation of the fundamentals involving the historical research is naturally not in their line, nor are their scientific training and their practical work of much help to them in getting the foundations of psychological knowledge. For this reason, even Freud saw himself obliged to skip the admittedly wearisome stage of comparative psychology and press forward into the conjectural and highly uncertain prehistory of the human psyche. In so doing, he lost the ground from under his feet, for he would not let himself be taught by the findings of ethnologists and historians, but transferred the insight he had gained from modern neurotics during consulting hours directly to the broad field of primitive psychology. He did not pay enough attention to the fact that under certain conditions there is a shift of emphasis and other psychic dominants come into play. The Freudian school got stuck in the Oedipus motif, i.e. the archetypal of incest, and hence their views remained predominantly sexualistic. They failed to recognize that the Oedipus complex is an exclusively masculine affair, that sexuality is not the only possible dominant in the psychic process, and that incest, because it involves a religious instinct, is far more expressive of the latter than the cause of it. I will not mention my own endeavors in this field, since for most people they have remained a book with 7 seals. The sexual hypothesis nevertheless possesses considerable power of conviction, because it coincides with one of the principal instincts. The same is true of the power hypothesis, which can appeal to instincts that characterize not only the individual, but also political and social movements. A rapprochement between the two standpoints is nowhere in sight unless we acknowledge the peculiar nature of the self, which embraces the individual as well as society. As experience shows, the archetypes possess the quality of transgressiveness. They can sometimes manifest themselves in such a way that they seem to belong As much to society as to the individual. They are therefore numinous and contagious in their effect, i.e., the emotional person who emotionalizes others. In certain cases, this transgressiveness also produces meaningful coincidences, i.e., a causal synchronistic phenomenon, such as the results of Ryan's ESP experiments. The instincts are part of the living totality. They are articulated with and subordinate to the whole. Their release as separate entities leads to chaos and nihilism because it breaks down the unity and totality of the individual and destroys them. It should be the task of psychotherapy, properly understood, to preserve and restore this unity. It cannot be the aim of education to turn out rationalists, materialists, specialists, technicians, and others of the kind who, unconscious of their origins, are precipitated abruptly into the present and contribute to the disorientation and fragmentation of society. By the same token, no psychotherapy can lead to satisfactory results if it confines itself to single aspects only. The temptation to do this is so great, and the danger of loss of instinct so threatening in the breathless tempo of modern civilization, that every expression of instinct must be watched very carefully, since it is in part the total picture and is essence for people's psychic balance. For these reasons, the sexual aspect of the UFOs merit our attention, as it shows that a very powerful instinct, like sexuality, has its share in the structure of the phenomenon. It is probably no accident that in one of the dreams a feminine symbol appears and in the other a masculine, in accordance with the reports of lens-shaped and cigar-shaped UFOs, for where one appears, we may expect its partner. The vision is a symbol consisting not only of archetypal forms of thought, but of instinctual elements too, so that it can justly lay claim to be a reality. It is not only historical, but topical and dynamic. Hence it does not appeal only to people's conscious technological fantasies or their philosophical speculations, but strikes deep down into their animal nature. This is what we would expect a genuine symbol to do. It must affect and express the whole person. However unsatisfactorily a sexual interpretation may be in this case, the contribution it makes should not be overlooked and must be given due consideration. In the same way, the power instinct expresses itself in both dreams. The dreamer appears in a unique situation. She is singled out, indeed chosen, like one whose countenance is burned by the divine fire. Both interpretations, so far as they claim to be exclusive, do away with the symbolic meaning of dreams and eliminate the individual in favor of the instinctual manifestations. The feebleness of the individual in the face of the overwhelming power of instinct is once more established. For anyone who was not yet aware of this fact, such an interpretation would of course be novel and impressive. But our dreamer does not belong to the host of ingénues, and in her case it would be pointless to reduce the dream in this way. She is, on the contrary, one of those moderns who realize that the elimination of the individual means. The paralyzing feeling of nothingness and lostness is compensated by the dream. She is the only one to withstand the panic and to recognize its cause. It is at her that the unearthly thing points, and on her it leaves the visible trace of its power. She is set apart as one of the elect. Such a gesture on the part of the unconscious naturally has a useful meaning only when feelings of inferiority and the senselessness of a mere functional existence threaten to stifle the personality. This case may serve as a paradigm for the widespread anxiety and insecurity of thoughtful people today, while at the same time revealing the compensating power of the unconscious. For a short commentary, there's a line in here: despite the advances in organic chemistry, we are still very far from being able to explain consciousnesses biochemical processes. That's a quote there. So I think this is interesting, thinking about where we are in terms of artificial intelligence, or whatever we want to call it, autonomous systems. And that we certainly aren't at the point where we have general intelligence or superintelligence yet, where something that is able to think and process like humans, but we're trying to get there. And then that kind of comes up, this issue of purpose. If we're able to get there, will we get there because of our phenomenal ability that we have exhibited of being able to silo or to separate, so we're just rationalistic and scientific? Or will we get there because we'll be able to fully integrate? And if we're able to get there, whether we are or not, then the question is going to be, what is the purpose of life? It'll bring it up to a very strong forefront. And I think that this piece of full integration and being able to live with all of our drives, which I would say that spirituality is as important a drive as sexuality and power and food, is going to be really important. How we define that and how we integrate spirituality, or whatever we call that, sense of being part of something and making a difference in that part, will be an important part of our human and earthly well-being. Dream 3. This dream is an excerpt from a longer dream which a 42-year-old woman patient recorded about 6 years ago. At the time, she had heard nothing of flying saucers and the like. She dreamt she was standing in a garden, when suddenly the humming of an engine became audible overhead. She sat down on the garden wall in order to see what was going on. A black metallic object appeared and circled over her. It was a huge flying spider made of metal with great dark eyes. It was round in shape and had a new and unique aeroplane. From the body of the spider there was a solemn voice, loud and distinct. It uttered a prayer that was intended as an admonition and a warning to everybody, for those on earth as well as the occupants of the spider. Excuse me. The gist of the prayer was, lead us downwards and keep us safe below. Carry us up to the height. Adjoining the garden was a large administrative building where international decisions were being taken. Flying incredibly low, the spider passed along the windows of the building for the obvious purpose of letting the voice influence the people inside and point out the way to peace, which was the way to the inner secret world. They were to take reconciling decisions. There were several other spectators in the garden. She felt somewhat embarrassed because she was not fully clothed. Commentary to Dream 3. In the preceding part of the dreamer's bed had stood close to the garden wall. In her dream, therefore, she had slept under the open sky and been exposed to the free influences of nature, which means psychologically the impersonal collective unconscious, for this forms the counterpart of our natural environment and is always projected upon it. The wall denotes a barrier separating the immediate world of the dreamer from a more distant one, administrative building. A round metallic object appears, described as a flying spider. This description fits the UFOs. As regards the designation spider, we are reminded of the hypothesis that UFOs are a species of insects, coming from another planet and possessing a shell or case that shines like metal. An analogy would be the metallic-looking chitinous covering of our beetles. Each UFO is supposed to be a single insect, not a swarm. Footnote. Sievers, Flying Saucers über Südafrika, page 157, mentions Gerald Hurd's hypothesis that there are a series of bees from Mars. Is Another World Watching? The Riddle of the Flying Saucers, New York, Harper, 1951. Harold T. Wilkins, in Flying Saucers on the Attack, mentions a report on a rain of threads supposed to come from unknown spiders. End of footnote. In reading the numerous reports, I must admit that I, too, was struck by the thought that the peculiar behavior of the UFOs was reminiscent of certain insects. To the speculative mind, there is nothing inherently impossible in the idea that under conditions nature could implement her knowledge in quite other forms than those mentioned earlier. For instance, instead of light-producing insects, she might evolve creatures capable of anti-gravity. In any case, our technological imagination often lags a long way behind nature's. Everything in our experience is subject to the law of gravity, with one exception, the psyche, which, as we experience it, is weightless itself. The psychic objects and gravity are, to the best of our knowledge, incommensurable. They seem to be different in principle. The psyche represents the only opposite of gravity known to us. It is anti-gravity, in the truest sense of the word. Its corroboration of this we cite as we cite the parapsychological experience of levitation and other psychic phenomena denied only by the ignorant, which revitalize time and space. Obviously, the flying spider is based on an unconscious fantasy of this kind. In the UFO literature, too, this reference is made to flying spiders in an attempt to explain the alleged rain of threads in Oleron and Gaelic. Footnote. Amy Michelle, The Truth About Flying Spiders. Flying Saucers, sorry. End of footnote. Note that the dream cannot help making a concession to modern technological fantasies. It calls the spider, quote, a new and unique aeroplane, unquote. The psychic nature of the spider is shown by the fact that it contains a voice, evidently issuing from something like a human being. This curious phenomenon reminds one of similar occurrences of insane people who can hear voices issuing from anything or anybody. Voices, like visions, are autonomous manifestations of the senses caused by the activity of the unconscious. Voices from the ether also occur in the UFO literature. Footnote, Wilkins, page 138. End of footnote. Emphasis is laid on the eyes, which denote seeing and the intention to see. The intention is expressed by the voice, whose message is addressed both to the earth dwellers and to the occupants of the spider. The association with aeroplane here gives rise to the illogical idea of a machine that transports passengers. The passengers are evidently thought of as quasi-humans, for the message is meant for them as well as for the human beings. We can therefore suppose that both are simply different aspects of human, e.g., the empirical human below on earth and the spiritual human in heaven. The cryptic message or prayer is spoken by a single voice, by a kind of prayer leader. He addresses himself to that which leads and carries, and this must be the spider. We are therefore obliged to examine the symbol of the spider somewhat more closely. As we know, although this animal is quite harmless in our latitude, it is for many people an object of horror and superstitious belief. Araignée du matin, un grand chagrin, araignée du soir, un grand espoir. That's the horror of, so that he translates this. The horror people feel for spiders has been widely described by, he doesn't translate it, by Jeremy Godliff in his story, The Black Spider. So, araignée du matin, spider of the morning, great chagrin, spider of the evening, great hope. So, sorry. When someone is not quite right in the head, we say in German that he spins and has cobwebs in the attic. Spiders, like all animals that are not warm-blooded or have no cerebral spinal nervous system, function in dreams as symbols of a profoundly alien psychic world. As far as I can see, they express contents which, although active, are unable to reach consciousness. They have not yet entered the sphere of the cerebrospinal nervous system, but are as though lodged in the deeper lying sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. In this connection, I remember the dream of a patient who had the greatest difficulty in conceiving the idea of a supraordinate totality of the psyche, and felt the utmost resistance to it. He had picked up the idea from one of my books, but, characteristically enough, was unable to distinguish between the ego and the self, and because of his hereditary taint, was threatened with a pathological inflation. In this situation, he dreamt that he was rummaging about in the attic of his house looking for something. In one of the attic windows, he discovered a beautiful cobweb, with a large garden spider sitting in the center. It was of a blue color, and its body sparkled like a diamond. The dreamer was deeply impressed by this dream, and it was in fact an impressive commentary on his identification with the self, all the more dangerous in view of his heredity. In such cases there is a real weakness of the ego, which cannot therefore afford any suggestion of taking second place, as that would fatally emphasize its littleness, and has to be avoided at all cost. Illusions, however, are inimical in life because they are unhealthy, and sooner or later you will trip over them. The dreamer therefore attempts a kind of corrective which, like the Delphic oracle, turns out to be ambivalent. It says, in effect, what is troubling you in the head attic is, though you may not know it, a rare jewel. It is like an animal that is strange to you, forming symbolically the center of many concentric circles, reminiscent of the center of a large or small world, like the eye of God in medieval pictures of the universe. Confronted with this, a healthy mind would fight against the identification with the center because of the danger of paranormic godlike likeness. Anyone who gets into the spider's net is wrapped around like a cocoon and robbed of his own life. She is isolated from her fellows so that they can no longer reach her, nor she them. She lives in the loneliness of the world creator, who is everything and has nothing outside herself. If on top of all this you have had an insane father, there is the danger that you will begin to spin yourself, and for this reason the spider has a sinister aspect which should not be overlooked. The round metallic spider of our dreamer probably has a similar meaning. It has obviously devoured a number of human beings already, or their souls, and might well be a danger to earth dwellers. This is why the prayer, which recognizes the spider as a divine being, requests it to lead the souls downwards and keep them safe below, because they are not yet departed spirits but living earthly creatures. As such, they are meant to fulfill their earthly existence with conviction and not allow themselves any spiritual inflation. Otherwise, they will end up in the belly of the spider. In other words, they should not set the ego in the higher place and make it the ultimate authority, but should be ever mindful of the fact that it is not sole master in its own house, and is surrounded on all sides by the factor we call unconscious. What this is in itself we do not know. We know only its paradoxical manifestations. It is our business to understand nature. It is no good getting impatient with it because it is so complicated and awkward. Not so very long ago there were medical authorities who did not believe in bacteria, and consequently allowed 20,000 young women to die of easily avoidable perpetual fever in Germany alone. The psychic catastrophe caused by the mental inertia of the experts did not appear in any statistics, and from this it is concluded that they are non-existent. The exhortation to remain below on earth is immediately followed by the paradoxical request, carry us up to the height. One might think of the saying in Faust, then to the depths. I could as well say height, it is all the same. Unquote. That was the quote. Were it not that the dreamer has simply separated the two processes by a hiatus. This shows that there is a sequence and not a coincidentia oppositorium. Evidently, a moral process is envisioned, a catabasis and an anabasis, the 7 steps downwards and the 7 steps upwards, the immersion in the crater followed by the ascendance of the heavenly generation in the transformation mysteries. The Mass, too, began with the Confiteor quia peccavit nimis. Apparently one has to lead downwards, because it is not easy for people to descend from their heights and remain below. In the first place, a loss of social prestige is feared, and in the second, a loss of moral self-esteem, when they have to admit their own darkness. Hence they avoid self-criticism in an amazing degree, preach to others and know nothing of themselves. They are happy to possess no self-knowledge, because then nothing disturbs the rosy glow of illusion. Below means the bedrock of reality, which despite all self-deceptions is there right enough. To get down to this and remain there seems to be a matter of pressing importance, if it is assumed that people today are living above their proper level. An inference of such a general scope is permitted by the dream, which shows the problem is in terms of a human group and therefore characterizes it as a collective problem. Actually, the dream has the whole of humanity in view, for the spider flies as near as possible to the window of the building where international decisions are being taken. It tries to influence the meeting and points the way that leads to the inner world, the way to self-knowledge. The dream expects that this will make peace possible. Accordingly, the spider plays the role of a savior who warns and brings a healing message. At the end, the dreamer discovers that she is insufficiently clothed. This very common dream motif usually indicates lack of adaptation or relative unconsciousness of the situation in which one finds oneself. This reminder of one's own fallibility and negligence is particularly appropriate at a time when other people are being enlightened, for in such cases there is always a lurking danger of inflation. The admonition to remain below has in our day given rise to theological apprehensions in various quarters. It is feared that this kind of psychology will result in a loosening of moral standards. Psychology, however, gives us a clearer knowledge not only of evil but also of good, and the danger of succumbing to the former is considerably less when you remain unconscious of it. No one who goes through the world with open eyes can ignore it. Moreover, she is not so likely to fall into a pit as a blind person. Just as the investigation of the unconscious is suspected by theologians of Gnosticism, so an inquiry into the ethical problems it raises is accused of antinomianism and libertarianism. No one in his right sense would suppose that after a thorough confession of sin, accompanied by repentance, he will ever sin again. It is 1,000 to 1 that he will sin again, and the very next minute, deeper psychological insight shows, in fact, that one cannot live at all without sinning in thought, word, and deed. Only an exceedingly naive and unconscious person could imagine that he is in a position to avoid sin. Psychology can no longer afford childish illusions of this kind. It must ensure the truth and declare the unconsciousness is not only no excuse, but is actually one of the most heinous sins. Human law may exempt it from punishment, but nature avenges herself the more mercilessly, for it is nothing to her whether a person is conscious of their guilt or not. We even learn that the parable of the unjust steward that the Lord praised his servant who kept a false account because he had done wisely. Not only to speak of the expurgated passage of Luke 6, where Christ says to the filer of the Sabbath, quote, "Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou dost, thou art blessed, but if thou knowest not, thou art accursed, and a transgressor of the law." Unquote. Increased knowledge of the unconscious brings a deeper experience of life and a greater consciousness, and therefore confronts us with apparently new situations that require ethical decision. These decisions had, of course, always existed, but were not clearly grasped either intellectually or morally, and were often left in a not unintentional half-light. In this way, one provides oneself with an alibi and can get out of an ethical decision. But with deeper self-knowledge, one is often confronted with the most difficult problems of all, namely conflicts of duty, which simply cannot be decided by any moral precepts, neither those of the Decalogue nor of other authorities. This is where ethical decisions really begin, for the mere observation of a codified "thou shalt not" is not in any sense an ethical decision, but merely an act of obedience, and in certain circumstances a convenient loophole that has nothing to do with ethics. In my long experience, I have never encountered a situation that made a denial of ethical principle easier for me or raised the slightest doubt in this regard. On the contrary, the ethical problem was sharpened with increasing experience and insight, and the moral responsibility became more acute. It became clear to me that in contrast to the general view, Unconsciousness is no excuse, but is far rather a transgression in the literal sense of the word. Although there are, as mentioned above, allusions to this problem in the Gospels, the Church has, for understandable reasons, not taken it up, but left the Gnostics to tackle it more seriously. As a result, Christians rely on the doctrine of privatio boni, and always think that they know what is good and what is evil, thus substituting the moral code for the truly ethical decision, which is a free one. Morality, consequently, degenerates into legalistic behavior, and that felix culpa remains stuck in the Garden of Eden. We are surprised at the decay of ethics in our century, and we contrast the standstill in this field with the progress of science and technology. But nobody is worried by the fact that a real ethos has disappeared behind a mass of moral precepts. An ethos, however, is a different thing that cannot be formulated and codified. It is one of those creative irrationalities upon which any true progress is based. It demands the whole person and not just a differentiated function. The differentiated function undoubtedly depends on people, on their diligence, patience, preservation, their striving for power, and their native gifts. With the aid of these things, one gets on in the world and develops. From this, one has learnt that development and progress depend upon people's own endeavors, their will and ability. But that is only one side of the picture. The other side shows people as they are and as they find themselves to be. Here one can alter nothing because one is dependent on factors outside their control. Here one is not the doer, but a product, and does not know how to change oneself. One does not know how one came to be the unique individual one is, and one has only the scantiest knowledge of oneself. Until recently, one even thought that their psyche consisted of what they knew of themselves, and was a product of a cerebral cortex. The discovery of the unconscious psychic process more than 50 years ago is still far from being common knowledge, and its implications are still not recognized. Modern people still do not realize that they are entirely dependent on the cooperation of the unconscious, which can actually cut short the very next sentence they propose to speak. One is unaware that they are continuously sustained by something, while at the same time they regard themselves exclusively as the doer. They depend on and are sustained by an entity they do not know, but of which they have intimations that occurred, or, as one can fitly say, revealed themselves to long-forgotten forebears in the gray dawn of history. Whence did they come? Obviously from the unconscious process, from the so-called unconscious, which still precedes consciousness in every new human life, as the mother precedes the child. The unconscious depicts itself in dreams and visions as it always did, holding before us images which, unlike the fragmented functions of consciousness, emphasize facts that relate to the unknown whole person, and only apparently to the function which interests us to the exclusion of all else. Although dreams usually speak the language of our particular specialism, canis panem somniat piscator piscis, the dog dreams of food, the fisherman of fish, they refer to the whole, or, at the very least, to what people also are, namely the utterly dependent creature they find themselves to be. In one striving for freedom, people feel almost instinctive aversion to this kind of knowledge, for they fear, not without reason, its paralyzing effect. One may admit this dependence on unknown powers exists no matter what they are called, but one turns away from them as speedily as possible, as from a threatening obstacle. So long as everything appears to go well, this attitude may even be an advantage. But things do not always turn out for the best, particularly today when, despite euphoria and optimism, we feel a tremor running through the foundations of our world. Our dreamer is certainly not the only person to feel afraid. Accordingly, the dream depicts a collective need and utters a collective warning that we should descend on earth and not rise up again, unless the spider carries up those who remain below. For when functionalism dominates consciousness, it is the unconscious that contains the compensatory symbol of wholeness, that, as I said, is respected by the image of the flying spider, which carries the one-sidedness and fragmentariness of the conscious mind. There is no development upwards unless it is facilitated by the unconscious. The conscious will alone cannot compel this creative act, and in order to illustrate this, the dream chooses the symbol of prayer. Since according to the Pauline view, we do not rightly know what we should pray for, the prayer is no more than a groaning in travail, Romans 8:22, which expresses our impotence. This enjoins on us an attitude that compensates a superstitious belief in people's will and ability. At the same time, the spider image denotes a regression of religious ideas to the theomorphic symbol of supreme power, a reversion to the long-forgotten stage where a monkey or a hare personifies the Redeemer. Today, the Christian Lamb of God and the dove of the Holy Ghost has, at most, the value of a metaphor. As again, it must be emphasized that in dreams symbolism, animals refer to instinctual processes, which play a vital part in animal biology. It is their process which determine and shape the life of an animal. For their everyday life, people seem to need no instincts, especially when they are convinced of the sovereign power of their will. One ignores the meaning of instinct and devalues it to the point of a trophy, not seeing how much they endanger their very existence through loss of instinct. When therefore dreams emphasize instinct, they are trying to fill a perilous gap in our adaptation to life. Deviations from instinct show themselves in the forms of affects, which in dreams are likewise expressed by animals. Hence, uncontrolled affects are rightly regarded as bestial or primitive and should be avoided. But we cannot do this without repressing them, that is, without splitting our consciousness. In reality, we can never escape their power. Somewhere or other they will continue to operate, even though they cannot be found in consciousness. At worst, they manifest themselves in a neurosis or in an unconscious arrangement of inexplicable mishaps. The saint, who seems exempt from these weaknesses, pays for his immunity with the sufferings and abnegations of earthly man, without which of course he would not be a saint. The lives of holy men show that the two sides cancel out. None can escape the chain of suffering that leads to sickness, old age, and death. We can and should, for the sake of our humanity, control our affects and keep them in check, but we should know that we have to pay dearly for it. The choice of currency in which we wish to pay the tribute is, sometimes, even left to us. Remaining down below and subordinating ourselves to a theomorphic symbol, which seems very like an insult to our human dignity, means no more than we should remain conscious of these simple truths and never forget that in point of anatomy and psychological, the earthly person, for all their high flights, is first cousin to the anthropoids. Should it be granted to them, however, to develop into something higher without crippling their nature, they are reminded that this transformation is not theirs to command, for they are dependent on factors they cannot influence. They must content themselves with a prayerful yearning and groaning in the hope that something may carry them upwards, since they are not likely to make a success of the Mutschenhassen experiment. Through this attribute, one constellates oneself at the same time dangerous powers in the unconscious, helpful if one understands them, dangerous if one misunderstands them. Whatever names one may give to these creative powers and potentialities within one, their actuality remains unchanged. No one can stop a religious-minded person from calling them gods or demons or simply God, for we know from experience that they act just like that. But certain people use the word matter in this connection, believing that they have said something. We must remind them that they have merely replaced X with Y and are no further forward than before. The only certain thing is our profound ignorance, which cannot even know whether we have come nearer to the solution of the great riddle or not. Nothing can carry us beyond, it seems as if, except the perilous leap of faith, which we must leave to those who are gifted and graced for it. Every real or apparent step forward depends on the experience of facts, the verification of which is, as we know, one of the most difficult tasks the human mind has to face. So I'm coming back to reading this after having been very busy and not been able to give myself the time to reading it for a while. And I started reading Flying Saucers because of the work that I'm doing with IEEE to help develop this standard, which is now an assessment for well-being impacts from artificial intelligence. I want to relate a little story. So I went to Berlin with my team to develop some part of the standard, and then after going to Berlin, I went to Paris to a conference, a workshop at the OECD on well-being, and then I wanted to spend some time with my father, he's Parisian. And while I was there, I stayed at an Airbnb. So I believe very strongly that it's really important to stay aware of what you don't know. And I feel like, this piece of really trying to look towards continual integration, knowing that there's those parts of us that we're not aware of that will surface, and that as we learn and grow, those parts will come forward in different ways. But I'll say this, that in Berlin, it was very, very intense. I had a team of 11 people, and we had a tight timeline, and it really took everything. Plus, I felt that I needed to get everything written up so that we could get to the next step with this project. So I was quite tired and had some travel mishaps, which happens when you're traveling, and it's okay, those things happen. And I ended up at this Airbnb with a host who was problematic. And things just kind of got from bad to worse. I got really sick. It was really good to see my dad, but also we had some very, very difficult conversations. And then the host, it was one of those things where things start tumbling out and you don't take time to really process when you're sick. And the penultimate day that I was there, I was standing in the living room, and across the room I see this huge spider crawl from one bed that didn't have an under the bed. It was just a platform. So I don't know where that huge spider came from, and then crawl under the other bed, and it was huge. It was about 2.5 inches diameter with its big, thick black legs, really thick black legs, and a big, thick, hairy, sort of orange-red body where like the head and the abdomen part were like kind of the same, not like a big, huge abdomen like you can see like in garden. Like some of those beautiful garden spiders have smaller heads, but huge round abdomens. It wasn't this. It was a phenomenally huge abdomen and very hairy. And I was petrified And at the same time, I was petrified with fear, and at the same time awed with the beauty of this spider. Um, and later I talked to my partner about it and like looked up and tried to figure out what kind of spider it was, and probably it was like a tarantula, which I wouldn't have put it past this person to have done something like that, because other things were happening at that Airbnb, which I really just should have left, but I was quite sick and not making good decisions. So I share the story because it's really interesting, having read this about this dream, and I mentioned that I'm reading this because I'm interested in what we're manifesting and how we can more consciously manifest our future and who we are with what we call artificial intelligence, which is really based on us, right? I mean, we're the ones that are creating this. It's our intelligence that's creating this intelligence. And unless we can really integrate, we create a world that will be separated and difficult and hard, instead of a world that is loving and kind and wise. So I'll think more about on that spider. It was very frightening, and I know that what Jung says about frightening dreams is that you turn to that which is so scary. And Charles, was it his name? Not Charles, but the guy, the dream tending guy, says you turn towards it and you ask it what it has to say. So I will spend some time thinking about that spider and asking it what it has to say. Very interesting manifestation. I will continue with the rest of chapter 2 in another video. If you've listened this far, thank you.